Get out of my common center before you break something.
I'm not
Get
going
that old
anywhere.
man out of my common center before he breaks something. That's what Captain Derek Collins said when 73-year-old Harold Meeks walked into the communications tent during joint exercise Iron Anvil. Harold didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there in his faded olive drab jacket, his hands spotted with age, his eyes quietly scanning the rows of dead screens and silent radios that had brought an entire military exercise to its knees. Every satellite uplink was down. Every encrypted channel was static. 2,000 soldiers across 3 bases had gone completely dark, and the United States Army's most advanced communications battalion couldn't do a thing about it. But Harold Meeks could, and before that day was over, every single person in that tent would understand exactly who they just tried to throw out. If this story moves you, type signal in the comments right now, because what this old veteran did next will leave you speechless. Harold Meeks had been retired for nearly 20 years by the time Iron Anvil came around. He lived in a small house about 4 miles from Fort Riley, Kansas, a modest place with a chain-link fence and a garage full of old radio equipment he still tinkered with on Sunday mornings. His wife, Dolores, had passed 6 years earlier, and since then Harold spent most of his time alone, listening to shortwave bands, attending the occasional VFW meeting, and walking his dog along the perimeter road near the base. He was a quiet man. Finn walked with a slight lean to the left from a knee that never quite healed after Korea. His neighbors knew him as the fellow who kept his lawn trimmed and always had a small American flag planted by his mailbox. What they didn't know, what almost nobody around Fort Riley knew anymore, was that Harold Meeks had once been one of the most skilled signals intelligence operators the Army had ever produced. He had enlisted in 1950, barely 18 years old, and by the time the Korean War reached its most desperate months, Harold was already running field communications for units operating deep behind enemy lines. He could build a working radio from salvage parts in under an hour. He could intercept, decode, and relay enemy transmissions in conditions that would have made most operators quit. He earned commendations that were still classified decades later. But Harold never talked about any of it. When people asked what he did in the service, he'd just say, "I listened to the radio." Joint Exercise Iron Anvil was a major event. It involved coordination between active duty Army units, National Guard elements, and reserve support battalions from across the Midwest. The exercise simulated a large-scale rapid deployment scenario, and communications were the backbone of the entire operation. The 57th Signal Battalion, stationed at Fort Riley, was tasked with maintaining all satellite uplinks, tactical data networks, and encrypted voice channels across 3 operating bases spread over a 100-mile radius. Captain Derek Holland, 29 years old and fresh off a systems modernization course at Fort Gordon, was the officer in charge of the Communications Operations Center. He was confident, technically proficient by the book, and absolutely certain that the new generation of digital satellite systems could handle anything the exercise threw at them. He had no patience for anything old, anything analog, or anyone who suggested the old ways might still matter. So when the satellite link started degrading on the second morning of the exercise, Holland wasn't worried. He assumed it was a software glitch. When the degradation turned into a complete blackout across all channels by noon, he still believed his team could troubleshoot their way back. He ordered diagnostic cycles, firmware resets, antenna realignments. Nothing worked. By 1400 hours, Iron Anvil was effectively paralyzed. No unit could talk to any other unit. The exercise command post had no contact with the field. Umpires couldn't transmit scenario updates. Medical coordination was impossible. 2,000 soldiers were operating blind, and the entire chain of command was watching. Harold Meeks happened to be on base that day. He'd been invited by a retired Master Sergeant friend to visit a small display of historical military communications equipment that had been set up in one of the older storage buildings as part of a heritage exhibit tied to the exercise. Harold had wandered through the display with quiet interest, pausing at a PRC-10 radio set from the Korean War era. running his fingers along its casing the way another man might touch the fender of a car he once drove cross-country. He recognized every component. He'd carried one just like it through frozen valleys and shattered ridgelines 50 years ago. When he stepped outside and noticed the unusual activity near the comming center, the vehicles coming and going, the officers walking fast with hard expressions, he asked a young private what was going on. The private, barely glancing at the old man in the worn jacket, said all comms are down. Whole exercise is frozen. Nobody can fix it. Harold nodded slowly. He stood there for a moment, watching. Then he walked toward the communications tent. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask permission. He just walked in, looked around at the rows of black screens and frustrated young soldiers, and started studying the equipment with the careful, methodical gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding how signals move through the air. That's when Captain Holland spotted him. "Who let a civilian into my operations center?" Holland barked across the tent. A sergeant near the door shrugged. Holland strode over to Harold, his jaw tight. "Sir, this is a restricted area during active exercises. You need to leave immediately." Harold looked at him calmly. "Your SATCOM birds are being jammed, or there's a solar event knocking out your canned frequencies," Harold said, his voice quiet but precise. "Either way, your digital backbone is gone, and your team is trying to restart systems that aren't going to come back until the interference passes. You're wasting time." Holland stared at him. A few soldiers nearby stopped what they were doing. "And who exactly are you?" Holland asked, his tone sharp with condescension. "Someone who used to do this for a living," Harold said. "A long time ago." Holland almost laughed. "Sir, with all due respect, our systems are a little more advanced than whatever you worked on. We've got this handled." Harold glanced at the dead screens. "It doesn't look handled to me, Captain." Holland pointed toward the tent flap. "Get that old man out of my comm center before he breaks something." Two soldiers accosted Harold outside. He didn't resist. He just walked out quietly, his hands in his pockets, and stood near the storage building where the heritage display was set up. He looked at the building for a long time. Then he went inside. What Harold did over the next 90 minutes would become one of the most talked-about moments in the history of Fort Riley, signal operations. Inside the storage building, buried under tarps and old equipment cases, Harold found what he was looking for. It was a BC 1000 radio set, a Korean War-era frequency-modulated transceiver that had been gathering dust for decades. It was incomplete. The handset was missing. Several vacuum tubes were cracked. The battery compartment was corroded. Any modern communications specialist would have looked at it and seen junk, a relic, a museum piece that belonged behind glass. Harold saw something else. He saw a radio, and he knew how to make a radio work. He went through the storage building methodically, pulling components from other old equipment, scavenging wire, capacitors, resistors, anything he could use. He found a hand-cranked generator from a GN58 set that still turned freely. He found copper wire coiled in an old field telephone kit. He found a soldering iron in a maintenance locker that still heated up when he plugged it in. He sat down on an old folding chair, spread the parts across a wooden table, and went to work. His hands were slow. Yes, his fingers didn't move the way they had in 1952, when he'd rebuilt a radio in a frozen foxhole while Chinese mortar round him. But the knowledge was still there. Every connection, every frequency calculation, every principle of signal propagation that he'd learned over a lifetime of listening to the invisible world of radio waves was carved into his mind as deeply as his own name. He replaced the cracked tubes with one salvage from another set. He rebuilt the handset using parts from a field telephone. He fabricated an antenna from copper wire and a wooden pole he found leaning against the wall. He wound the hand-cranked generator and tested the voltage output. Steady, clean, enough to power the set. A young specialist named Rivera had been watching from the doorway for the last 20 minutes. She'd been sent to grab something from storage and had stopped, transfixed, as this old man methodically assembled a working radio from what looked like a pile of scrap metal. "Sir," she finally said, "what are you building?" Harold didn't look up. "A way to talk to people," he said. Rivera stepped closer. She could see his hands moving with purpose, each connection deliberate, each solder joint clean, despite the slight tremor in his fingers. "Does Captain Holland know you're doing this?" she asked. "Captain Holland told me to leave," Harold said. "But the Army taught me a long time ago that the mission comes first, and right now your mission is dead in the water because nobody can communicate." Rivera watched him for another moment. "Can I help?" she asked. Harold looked up at her for the first time. He studied her face, saw something there, the same hunger to solve the problem that he'd felt his whole career. "Do you know what a ground plane antenna is?" he asked. "I can learn," she said. Harold almost smiled. "Then yes, you can help." Together, they set up the antenna outside the storage building. Harold had Rivera run the copper wire in a specific pattern. Explaining as they worked how signal propagation changed with antenna height and ground conductivity, principles that hadn't changed since Maronia and never would, no matter how many satellites the military put into orbit. He tuned the BC 100 and 700 in Horo 0 to a frequency he calculated in his head, a low-band FM frequency that he knew from experience could cut through atmospheric interference that would kill higher-band digital signals. He checked every connection one final time. Then he picked up the rebuilt handset, pressed the transmit key, and spoke. "Any station. Any station. This is Sierra Mike 71 transmitting on 29er. 7 MHz from Fort Riley. Exercise Iron Anvil Communications Relay. Request acknowledgement. Over." Static. Harold adjusted the tuning slightly. His ear pressed close to the speaker, listening with the same focus he'd used to pick enemy transmissions out of noise 50 years ago. He transmitted again, more static, then faintly a voice. "Sierra Mike 71, this is Anvil, Maine at Camp Funston. We read you weak but clear. How are you transmitting?" "All SATCOM is down. Over." Harold keyed the handset. "Anvil, Maine transmitting on a rebuilt BC 10000 field radio. Hand crank power wire antenna ready to relay traffic. Over." There was a long pause on the other end. Then the voice came back, and even through the static, Harold could hear the disbelief. "Sierra Mike 71, confirm you are transmitting on a Korean War-era field radio." "Over." Harold exhaled himself a small smile. "Confirmed. The old ones still work. Send your traffic." "Over." Word spread through the exercise command structure like a shockwave, while the entire 57th Signal Battalion sat helpless with millions of dollars of dead digital equipment. A 73-year-old man in a storage building was relaying critical exercise communications on a radio he'd rebuilt from spare parts and salvage. Within 30 minutes, Harold had established a relay network, talking Rivera and 2 other young soldiers through the process of setting up additional improvised stations using other old equipment from the storage building. He assigned frequencies, calculated propagation windows, and managed the network with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this under conditions 1,000 times worse. The exercise resumed. Units received their orders. Medical coordination was restored. Umpires transmitted their updates. Iron Anvil was back on its feet, running on technology from 1951, operated by a man who most people on that base would have dismissed as just another old-timer who didn't understand the modern army. Captain Holland stood outside the storage building, watching through the open door as Harold managed the communications relay. His face was unreadable, but the soldiers around him noticed that his hands were clenched at his sides, and he hadn't said a word in nearly 20 minutes. The satellite links came back online late that afternoon. It had been a severe solar event, just as Harold had guessed, that disrupted the K-band frequencies the modern systems relied on. Once the interference passed, the digital networks restored themselves automatically, and the 57th Signal Battalion resumed normal operations. But by then, the story of what had happened in the storage building had reached Colonel James Whitfield, the exercise commander. Whitfield was a 30-year veteran himself, a man who understood history and respected it. He drove to the communications area personally. When he walked into the storage building and saw Harold Meek sitting at the wooden table, the rebuilt BC 1000 still warm beside him, Whitfield stopped in the doorway. He stared at the old man for a long moment. Then he said, "Harold Meeks." Harold looked up. Recognition crossed his face slowly. "Jimmy Whitfield," he said quietly. "Last time I saw you, you were a second lieutenant who couldn't read a map." Whitfield laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that made every soldier nearby turn and stare. "And you were the sergeant who kept my platoon alive in the chosen reservoir." "Because you could get a radio working in a blizzard," Whitfield said. He walked forward and took Harold's hand in both of his. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitfield said, turning to the soldiers who had gathered, "this man is Master Sergeant Harold Meeks, retired Signals Intelligence, Korea and Vietnam. He received the Silver Star for maintaining communications under enemy fire during the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, keeping an entire regiment connected to command when every other signal line had been cut. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his career contributions to Signals Intelligence. His work in Vietnam is still classified. And today, when every piece of modern equipment in this exercise failed, he walked into a storage building and did exactly what he's always done. He made the radio work. The silence in that building was absolute. Captain Holland, who had wed Colonel Whitfield in, stood frozen near the wall. His face had gone pale. Every soldier who had watched Harold get escorted out of the comm center hours earlier now stood at attention. Not because anyone ordered them to, but because they understood what they were looking at. Whitfield reached into his pocket and produced a challenge coin, the kind senior officers carry to honor exceptional service. He pressed it into Harold's palm. "Master Sergeant Meeks," he said, "on behalf of everyone involved in Iron Anvil, thank you. You saved this exercise, and you reminded every single person here of something they should never forget." Harold looked down at the coin, then back at Whitfield. His eyes were bright, but his expression was steady. The same quiet composure he'd carried through decades of service and years of being invisible. "I just did what the Army trained me to do, Colonel," Harold said. "The equipment changes, the frequencies change, but the principles don't. Signal finds a way." Specialist Rivera, standing nearby, wiped her eyes. She'd spent 90 minutes watching this man work, learning more about communications in that time than she had in her entire training pipeline. She stepped forward and saluted. She'd never saluted a retired soldier before, but it felt like the only thing that made sense. One by one, other soldiers in the building followed. Harold Meek, 73 years old, standing in a dusty storage building next to a radio he'd rebuilt from scraps, received a salute from every soldier present. In the weeks that followed, the story of Harold Meeks and the Korean War radio became legend at Fort Riley. Colonel Whitfield personally wrote a commendation letter that was entered into the exercise's official after-action report. The 57th Signal Battalion revised its training curriculum to include a module on analog backup communications, with Harold's improvised relay network used as the case study. Captain Holland requested a meeting with Harold. It was private, and no one knows exactly what was said. But soldiers who saw Holland afterward said he looked like a man who had learned something important about humility. Specialist Rivera applied for a transfer to a Signals Intelligence unit, citing her experience during Iron Anvil as the moment she found her calling. She wrote Harold a letter thanking him, and he wrote back 4 pages of careful handwriting, explaining the fundamentals of radio propagation and ending with the words, "The most important thing about communication isn't the equipment. It's the willingness to listen." Harold went back to his small house near the base, back to his shortwave radios and his morning walks and his quiet life. But something had changed. The gate guards at Fort Riley started waving to him when he drove past. Young soldiers from the Signal Battalion began stopping by his house on weekends, asking questions about antenna theory and old radio sets. Harold would sit with them in his garage, a cup of coffee in his hand, and teach them things no manual contained. The art of hearing a signal in the noise, the patience to troubleshoot without a screen to guide you, the understanding that technology is only as good as the person behind it. He never bragged. He never told war stories unless someone asked. He was the same quiet, unassuming man he'd always been. But now people knew. They knew that the old man with the slight lean and the faded jacket had once held an entire regiment together with nothing but a radio and his bare hands. They knew that when the modern world failed, he was the one who brought it back. And they knew that respect isn't something you give based on what you can see. It's something you owe based on what you're willing to learn. Harold Meek spent his life listening. And on one critical day, at Fort Riley, the entire United States Army finally listened back. If you believe that experience and service deserve respect, no matter someone's age or appearance, subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the signal always finds a way.